Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Eric Coleman with IIST and I will be the moderator for today's webinar, part 2 of Defect Prevention, the Role of Testers in Improving Process and Reducing Cost of Quality by Dr. Magdy Hanna. We're excited you're able to join us today and set aside an hour to attend this webinar. This webinar is one of a series of free webinars to introduce the topics as well as the presenters of the upcoming SQTM conference in San Diego, California, September 13th through the 18th at the Sheraton San Diego Hotel and Marina. The conference focuses on advancing the test management and quality management professions by providing practical methods based on best practices. The ongoing theme of the conference, Practical, Proven, Feasible, keeps a focus on what works. To view the conference program and more information, visit www.qualitymanagementconference.com. Be sure to join us for the next webinar in the series, Estimating and Controlling Test Projects by Robin Goldsmith, on June 18th from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. Central Standard Time. To learn more about this and other webinars in the series, go to www.qualitymanagementconference.com. I will now turn the webinar over to today's presenter, Dr. Magdy Hanna. Dr. Hanna?
All right, good morning or good afternoon, depending on your time zone. Okay, my name is Magdy Hanna. I am the CEO of the International Institute for Software Testing. I'm also the conference chair for the International Conference on the Software Quality and Test Management, which is going to be held in San Diego. And this session today, as well as all the other sessions you've been joining over the last several months, they are all brought to you by the International Conference on Software Quality and Test Management. So hopefully you will see the website for the conference and you look at the program. Would like to spend the next hour with you today to talk about defect prevention. Part one of this subject was taught by Michael Ennis, one of our senior instructors, and this is part two. Here's what I plan to cover today. We're simply going to talk about why we need to do defect prevention. Obviously, the answer is probably obvious, but I need to kind of quickly make sure that we all understand the difference between quality control and the quality assurance. Then we'll talk about 4 different approaches or 4 different techniques, if you will, by which we can help our project team improve our process. It's not a secret why we want to do defect prevention. It is known about test professionals and test teams in general that they are about defect detection. We always get an application or a system or whatever we get from our developers, and we run tests and we find bugs and we report bugs. So this is normally how it works. You take an initial build or an iteration if you're working, or a sprint if you're working on an agile project. You run some tests, and as a result of running the tests you find some bug reports, or if you don't want to call them bug reports, you can call them anything else you want. The bottom line is developers will take your issues or your problems and they're going to fix them, and they will give you the bug fixes, which you'll have to retest anyway, but probably you know very well what else you get with those bug fixes. What we normally get with the bug fixes, and I'm sure you guessed it right by now, is more bugs, more broken software, more broken logic, things that worked before that are not working anymore. And ideally, yes, if you have a good regression test process, you could find some of those. The problem is when we retest the bugs, bug fixes, we don't think about all the other issues, the other problems that have been introduced as a result of fixing bugs. Now, if you'd like to know what the literature says about the number of newly inserted problems or bugs as a result of fixing some, I mean, different people say different things. Some people say it's a 1 to 4, some people would say 1 to 3, meaning that in the average, every time a developer fixes a problem, they break the software in 3 or 4 other places. Well, in fact, I have been able always to confirm with developers that it's a minimum of 1-to-1. You can do the same, by the way. You can go back to your developer today and ask any one of your developers and say, is it possible that you guys always, when you fix a problem, you never create any more problems? However, I suggest that you be careful when you ask this kind of question, right? I don't believe any developer that I've known would say, yes, we don't break any other problems. And I've always asked the developers, I said, okay, would you agree that in the average, it's at least one bug? And I'm saying the average here, meaning what? Meaning that some developers can fix the problems without breaking the software any other place. Other developers can be fixing one problem, breaking software in 3-4 other places. And the same developer over time, they perform differently. So a developer could be fixing a problem today and not causing any other problems, but could be fixing a problem tomorrow and breaking the software in other places. So in the average, it's one. And if we just agree to that, okay, then we have a major problem. Because those problems that get inserted, they are not known to us. And what typically happens is that they go out to the customer. And the customer also does not know about them. And nothing, in my opinion, frustrates your customers and your users more than functionality that worked before and is no longer working. That's the worst thing. And when this repeats itself many times, well, the customers will lose confidence in the test team and the development team altogether. They will think that IT or the software team or the development and testing, whatever they call us, not capable of supporting their operations, whether it is a business operation or otherwise. So the problem now of finding the problems is not only in the cost of fixing those, and it's not only in the fact that the test team has to wait until they get fixed and they get retested, excuse me. The real cost that I'm talking about is the interruption in operation because of the newly created bugs. As a result, in my opinion, we need to focus a little bit more on what Dr. Edward Deming called quality assurance. So I'm certain some of you already know the difference between quality assurance and the quality control, or better yet, the difference between quality assurance and testing. If you've been reading in the literature, if you've been around for a long time, you know the difference. And this is a summary of the difference. So maybe some of you already have the word QA in your title or in the name of your organization or in the name of your process. But you need to understand what QA really involves. QA, as Dr. Edward Deming taught us over 45 years ago, it's all about focusing on the process, all about trying to improve the process to prevent the problems from getting into the product. In QA, we do not focus on a product. We do not focus on a release. We do not focus on one sprint, but rather we focus on the process by which things are done. We focus on our test process and how we designed our tests and how we collaborated with our developers. We focus on our requirement process and see how requirements were communicated with us and how we reviewed requirements. We could possibly focus on the development process, and I'm sure many of you will say, I have no control over the development process. But that's really the trick. That's what I'm talking about today. You can help improve all other processes without getting your nose into those processes. You can do your job in a way such that others will learn how to do a better job. When I ask test teams, when I teach them my typical courses in software testing, and I ask them the very typical question in the morning of the first day, and I say, when you test, what are you trying to achieve? And I'm sure you can ask yourself the same question. As a test professional, what are some of your goals and objectives? And of course, some of the typical goals are, I want to make sure the system works as expected. I want to make sure to find as many problems as possible. I want to make sure that the release is going to be good, all that stuff. But you can see now, all our goals and objectives are focusing so much on the product, focusing so much on the release. Of course, we're testing people. We're quality control people. That's all what we do. And I go back and tell them, I want you to think about these two important objectives. And of course, if you have taken my courses, you've seen that. And in general, the objective is help others do a better job. More specifically, one of your objectives has to be to help developers write better code and to help requirement writers, product owners, and others to write better requirements. And that is possible, and if we do our job in this manner. Okay? So in quality control or in testing, we are focusing on finding problems in that product that we have in our hand, whether the product is a release or a sprint, but we have a product in our hand. If we want to be quality assurance people, then we need to make sure that we do our job in a way that help focus on the process. So I have been telling test professionals for over 15, 18 years now that we must all become QA professionals at heart. How do we do this? In fact, QA, in my opinion, is just a way of living. Any person, testing professional or otherwise, we need to become QA people in our heart. And what I mean here, which you probably know, is we need to learn from bad experiences. We need to learn from bad experiences to prevent problems from happening in the future. I don't know if I have a problem with the audio or not, but I have a message on my screen telling me that the quality of my audio is being degraded. No, not sure why. Okay, so in our own lives, you know this without me telling you this. We have to learn how to look at problems, mistakes, errors, and find out why this happened. And we go back to the root cause of the problem and try to prevent that problem in the future. We do it in our own life all the time. So why not do it in our profession? All right. There are certain things that we can do in the way we do our job. I'm not saying that we're going to leave our job as test professionals and do something else. No, we're not getting paid to do anything else. We're getting paid to run tests and find bug reports and report them. But let me give you just the first thing you're going to think about here. Closing the gap between development and testing with collaboration. What do I mean by that? It turns out that, and you probably already know this, developers write the code in a certain way and we test in a certain way, and we never really can test everything that developers are doing. Whether you're willing to believe me or not, there is always a gap between what developers are doing and what testers are doing. And to me, the most critical objective in a project is to try to close that gap. And closing the gap can only come with collaborations. Of course, if you work in an agile project, you might think that this gap does not exist, because some people look at what I have here on the screen and think this gap existed only in non-agile projects. But tell me, when I say requirements are always incomplete, are user stories complete? No, user stories are also always incomplete. In fact, user stories are much less complete than requirements. Most details that come up during development. Does this happen only in non-agile projects? In fact, it happens much more in agile projects. Why? Because in agile projects, we don't really spend enough time to analyze and understand the user story. Although, of course, we have those wonderful agile meetings and the Scrum meetings where we can ask questions about the user stories. But anyone can tell me that developers move on to development and they start writing code only after we have full understanding of all the details of a user story or a requirement? No. The problem still exists in agile projects. And some of these problems exist much more in agile projects. All right. Developers will always make assumptions. Everyone makes assumptions. I make assumptions while I'm sitting here talking to you, right? I make assumptions that all of you are hearing me fine. Everyone, we all make assumptions all the time. There is nothing wrong with making assumptions. What's wrong is that we do not validate our assumptions, as I tell people all the time. Any assumption you make remains invalid until you validate it. Doesn't matter what it is. Developers make assumptions when they write code all the time. Some developers, some good developers, will walk out of their cubicle and go to and reach out to someone and ask a question. And by asking the question and receiving an answer, they are validating their assumption. Some developers will not do that, and you know it very well. I myself make assumptions sometimes without validating them. When the developers make assumptions without validating them, what happens? They go and write code and do design based on those assumptions. And the test team does not know anything about those assumptions. And of course, excuse me, if you don't know anything about the assumptions, then you can't test the code that was written based on those assumptions. As I always say, you can't test what you don't know. If a developer makes an assumption, and even if he or she goes and validates the assumption with a product owner or with a business analyst or anyone else, and the test team remains out of the loop, the assumption has been validated somehow, design and the code has been written, and the test team is not aware of what has been written. We rely on the requirement, the incomplete requirement. And sometimes we rely on some other artifacts like what people call design specs, functional specs, user interface design, prototypes. We could. And yes, absolutely. The more we do of this, the more we rely on artifacts other than requirements, the better we are. The more we're going to learn about those assumptions that are made and the requirements that have changed during the development time. The only thing I want to tell you here that if you rely on requirements, which I know we all do, and I have been in projects myself, larger projects. Yes, I admit that they were non-agile projects, where the level of code coverage was as low as 50 to 60%. The code coverage refers to how much of the code have we tested. If you ever use a code coverage tool to tell you how much of the code have your test cases exercised, you'd be shocked. We've known about the code coverage problem for a long time. And one good solution to code coverage, if we can do it, is that we force developers to do what we call code-based testing. Meaning that they take their code and analyze the logic and analyze the path within the code and run test case and write test cases to exercise all that code. Well, guess what? Developers will not do that. Developers will do some level of testing, but they will not do code-based testing. So the result is the same. We end up by a lot of code we have not tested. So what does this have to do with the process? If you have attended some of my courses before, you probably heard me talking about scenarios. And I was interviewed just 2 days ago by the Software Development magazine. And I said the same thing. I will continue to believe that scenario-based development and testing is one of the most powerful things we know. Now, I don't know how many people adopt it out there, but I know how many people I've been teaching them and how many companies have used my teachings in their projects. When I say scenario-based development and testing, I mean a chart similar to this. This is a process. This is a framework, if you will. This is simply said we're going to take a requirement or a user story and we build the scenarios. This is not testing here. When we build the scenarios, whether we build the scenarios directly based on questions and answers or through any other models or techniques, whatever it is. So the bottom line here, we have scenarios. We validate scenarios. That's us. That's the test team doing that. We build the scenarios, we validate scenarios. This process suggests that only when we take our scenarios and validate them with developers and the business analysts and product owners and everyone else, then developers can take those scenarios and start writing the design and the code. And we can take those scenarios and build our test cases and our test scripts. Okay. When we follow this process, and I'm telling you that based on what other companies did, I keep saying there is no way for a developer to write code for anything that we are not testing. Why? Because developers are writing code to the scenarios. Testers are writing test cases to the scenarios. If you've got one scenario which is written in one line, one sentence, a developer may write a block of code, 2 blocks of code, 3, 6, 3 modules, whatever it is. They take the scenario and they try to implement it in the code. A tester will take the same scenario and will write test cases to cover that scenario. Those test cases test the code that was written. But of course, this is only a process. If developers are not good and we as testing people are not good, then guess what? We're not going to follow the process. A developer is going to go and start writing code outside the scenarios, but that should be prohibited. If a developer is sitting here trying to write code or come up with some design decision and they are thinking something that has not been addressed here, what do? They need to go back and ask the question. And when they receive an answer, there might be a new scenario that needs to be written based on the answer they received. The scenario gets validated again. and then they write the code for that scenario. And developers will learn about that scenario and they will write test cases for that scenario. I'm not telling you I'm not telling you anything that is not happening now. Now, when we come down here to execute the tests that we have designed based on scenarios, two things are going to happen. And these two things are, in my opinion, the most critical objectives that we must always strive for. The first one is that there will be major reduction in the number of bug reports written by the test team. Major reduction. You're not going to find as many problems as you used to find before. And that's what? That's defect prevention. What we've done so far is we followed this very simple process to prevent defects from being in the product, to minimize the number of bug reports we write, and of course the number of problem reports received by customers. Okay, I am going to sit here now and tell you that I don't know of any other method that can help the test team reduce the number of bug reports they write. If you know one, please share it with me now so that I can share it with everyone else. This is what I've been teaching people for 18, 20 years now. And it works. Don't work from requirements. Don't try to take requirements and ask questions about them and just run to write your test cases. And don't give those requirements to developers to write their test cases, to their code. No and no, it does not work. Writing code based on requirements or user stories and writing test cases based on requirements or user stories does not work, does not work. That's what I'm saying. Please understand that. And the two boxes that I'm adding here, defining scenarios and validating scenarios, are nothing. If you have not heard about scenarios before, a scenario is nothing more than a condition or a situation that could possibly happen in production. And I don't understand it. If the development team and the test team are not working for things that are going to happen in production, I don't know what they're working on. I understand the requirement is there, but the requirement is not complete enough. The requirement was vague. Possibly the requirement is ambiguous. All requirements. No one here should tell me that, oh no, but the requirements we get are good. No one knows how to write good requirements. No one, including myself, knows how to write good requirements or user stories. Even if you include those acceptance criteria with your user stories. I've seen those acceptance criteria. Some of them are good, some of them are not. So if you write user stories in an agile project and you come and write acceptance criteria, what you want to do is to make sure that those acceptance criteria map to those scenarios I'm talking about. So your acceptance criteria needs to address every possible condition, every possible situation that could happen in production. When I ask people who take my 3-day course on best practices in software testing, planning, and design, when I ask them to take the requirement and ask questions and they come up with scenarios and validate scenarios, and they do this as a team exercise. I go after that and ask them a very critical question. I said, how many of the scenarios you came up with are not explicitly stated in the requirement? And I have that spreadsheet. I have a spreadsheet of data that I collected over the years. The typical answer is this: more than twice as much of the, or as many as twice as many, I should say, of the original scenarios. So for example, you get a team who says we've got about 45 scenarios. I say, out of those 45 scenarios, how many of those were not explicitly stated in the original requirement? And the answer typically is maybe only 15 of those were in the original requirements and the other 30 were not. And I always ask the question, says, okay, if we did not come up with those scenarios, what could we have done? We would have tested only 15 of the scenarios based on the requirement. So I told you when you come down here to run the test cases, two things are going to happen. One of them is a major reduction in the number of bug reports written by the test team and of course by the customer and everyone else. I have companies who tell me that they were able to reduce the number of bug reports here by more than 70%. The other thing that you'll see happening here is that there is a major increase in code coverage. So if you ever decide to use a code coverage tool, you will see that code coverage is going easily up to the upper 90%. Why? Because what I said, developers have not written any code that you're not testing. Every single block of code is being tested here. In fact, if you use a decent tool that can allow you to map your test cases to the code, if you use Romana ALM, which is the ALM product that I architected myself to support this, you can go to the scenario screen and you can be looking at a scenario. And from the scenario screen, there's a button to click on to see all the test cases. From the same scenario screen, there is another button to click on to see all the code that was written for that scenario. So as a result, you can see what code has been written and what test cases have been written to test the code. It's not that you as a test professional are going to read the code. No, but for developers to make sure that all their code has been tested. All right. So to me, that's, in my opinion, the most powerful technique or approach I know of that's out there that can help us prevent problems. Defect prevention. And as I said, if you know of anything else, please share with me. I'm not getting anything. To share anything with me, please click on the questions tab and write down anything and I will share it with everyone else. All right. So I said, try to close the gap. So my objective here is to try to close the gap between what developers are doing and what we as testers doing. And you close the gap through collaboration. Here are some forms of collaboration. One, I already discussed, sharing and validating scenarios with developers. Ideally, scenarios should be developed before developers start writing any design or any code. Or at least they're still in the process of writing the code. And you walk to them and say, I want you to look at this with me. If you keep doing this, trust me, over time, not a very long time, maybe one project is not gonna go very well because developers have already written the code that's not compatible with the scenarios. But very soon they'll have to go and modify their code, because otherwise, if those scenarios are the scenarios you are using to test, then they're going to find out that they're going to get a lot of bug reports. So if they are interested in reducing the number of bug reports written on their code, a developer will always go back and modify their code accordingly. Something that test professionals do not do, which is attending or participating in code or design reviews. Well, I've seen some test professionals attending some code reviews or design reviews. But I always ask them, I say, what's the purpose? Why are you going there? Why are you attending code or design reviews? And I have not seen one one test professional telling me the real reason why we should be there. And to me, the real reason for participation in code and design reviews is to close the gap, is to listen to what developers are saying and trying to map this back to something we have in our scenarios or in our test cases. And if we find a mismatch, if we find that a developer is talking about something that I am not testing, guess what? You got to raise your hand. You got to find out what they're talking about. I know sometimes it's difficult because sometimes a discussion in a code review meeting goes over your head because you keep talking technical jargons and development things and you don't know what they're talking about. That's fine. Just try to not let those details bother you. But that's why it's not only you who have to be focusing on closing the gap. To me, the most critical objective of a code review meeting or design review meeting is making sure we close the gap. Most development teams have the misunderstanding of code and design reviews. They think that the code and design review meetings are to make sure that the code works correctly. No, testing will make sure the code works correctly. But certainly, a design review meeting is about presenting a design, making sure it is acceptable by the group of people sitting there. Not you, by the way, not you as a test professional. You're sitting there as a test professional to try to understand the design to the best of your ability and to try to see if that design you're listening to requires you to do any more testing than what you're planning to do. Closing the gap. Now, what if your development teams do not do any code or design review meetings? I always suggest that the test teams, QA teams must propose the idea of a weekly or even a daily update meetings. And I'm not talking about the Scrum meetings that we do in an Agile projects. The key point here is update. Everyone needs to update everyone else with anything that happened during that period of time that can affect someone else's work. So you need to know during the day, so the weekly update meetings are about work that has been done, not the work we are going to be doing. In Scrum meetings or stand-up meetings in the morning, we talk about what we're going to be doing today. In update meetings, we talk about what we did yesterday or what we did today if we're meeting at the end of the day. If that meeting is happening at 4 o'clock in the afternoon before we go home, then we talk about what we did during the day that could possibly affect someone else's work. In my opinion, one of the strongest form of collaboration is those update meetings. Let me tell you this. Collaboration is going to improve only if it is documented. In fact, I totally caution against side discussions or side collaborations and backdoor collaborations. It might be acceptable in an Agile project that you leave your office or cubicle or desk and walk to someone else's desk to ask a question. It is not acceptable in my world, because any discussions like that are not documented anywhere, and the gap remains to exist. If I am a developer and I'm trying to work on something and I have a design decision to make, and the Agile framework encourages me to walk to the product owner anytime and ask any question, and I do, and I go and do that, and I walk back to my desk and I sit down and do the design and the code accordingly. Guess what? I have not improved anything, but rather I have I have increased the gap between what I'm doing and what testers are testing. This is not only valid if all parties are involved. I understand in an agile project all parties are involved in the morning meeting, but not everything come up in the morning meeting. We know that. In a non-agile projects, we don't meet, period. In non-agile projects, we just go and ask questions and get answers and do our work accordingly. So what I am saying here by online repository to document all collaborations, meaning that use a collaboration tool. Use a collaboration tool that instead of walking to someone's desk to ask a question, you need to just click a button or two and write your question. And someone else is going to see that question and going to click a button or two to answer the question. So if I am not around to hear the question, I can always go back to that tool and find out what questions have been asked yesterday when I was not here and what answers have been given. And I can adjust my work accordingly. You see that? I can adjust my work accordingly. So with that, there will not be gap. I mean, I'm sorry that I'm talking very high level here. These things I teach in my classes, and they are available out there. I mean, go and search for any collaboration tool, and many of those are free anyway. But if you use the Romana ALM, the same thing. You got requirements, you got scenarios, and you got collaboration. And I tell people all the time, don't leave your desk and go and walk to someone else and ask questions. Don't meet someone in the hallway and ask them questions. No. In fact, I tell people, don't even go to meetings to ask questions if those meetings are not going to be documented. I know when I speak to agile people, they say, well, that documentation, that D word we don't like, because we're not supposed to spend too much time documenting anything. I'm not talking about too much time. I'm talking about, and instead of walking to someone else and to his cubicle and you find that he or she is not there, and you walk back to your cubicle and you again another hour to walk again and ask the question, save all that wasted time. And go to your screen and click a button or two, go to your collaboration tool and ask the question. And I use this every day with my teams that are scattered all over the globe, because we don't have way to walk to their cubicle. I cannot walk from here to India or any other country, right? So everything is done through collaboration tools. All right. What is this thing about sharing testing responsibility with developers? We know that developers are supposed to do some level of testing, right? We're going to collaborate. We're going to work together. And instead of always suspecting, have developers done any testing? No. This framework will help you work very, very smoothly with your developers. All right. The outcome of a scenario, let me explain to you how we're going to do that. The outcome of the scenario process is what? Let me go back to the chart here. Is a set of scenarios that have been validated. And let me tell you this. If you follow this process, you will come up with much more scenarios than what you can ever test. All right? So what do you do now? You go to my next approach, which is totally risk-based. You list your scenarios. And this happens, by the way, a requirement by requirement. And for each scenario, you decide on these three factors: the impact of failure, the frequency, the probability of failure. Okay? And just to utilize a simple scheme, high, medium, low. Impact of failure is about if that scenario were to fail in production, what's the impact? Frequency is about how often do we think this scenario is going to happen. Probability of failure is about what is the likelihood for that scenario to fail in production. And many test professionals, many people have problem with this column here because they say, I don't know. The scenario may or may not fail in production. The only way I would know is to test it. And I say, no, I want you to determine this parameter here so that you can decide if you should test the scenario or not. One of the factors you can consider here, I already mentioned. When I said, typically you come up with a larger number of scenarios. Many of those scenarios were not explicitly stated in the requirement. Well, guess what? Those scenarios that were not explicitly stated in the requirement have the highest probability of failure. So I will mark all those scenarios as high when it comes to probability of failure. Why? Because if they are not explicitly stated in the requirement, why should I believe that developers have written any code to handle it? Most likely they never did. All right. Once you determine those three factors for each scenario, then you start calculating the testing priority. And the testing priority is calculated simply based on the average number. So if you consider high to mean 3 and low is 1 and medium is 2, so 3 plus 1 plus 2, that's 6, divided by 3 is 2.0, right? 1 plus 1 plus 3 is 5, divided by 3 is 1.6. This is the number that would represent the testing priority based on what? Based on these three factors. Once you have that, you start sorting this spreadsheet based on the testing priority, and you find out how many scenarios. And you do this on a requirement by requirement or user story by user story. So for one user story, you had 45 scenarios. Obviously, you cannot test all 45 scenarios, but you do the risk-based model, and you find out that out of the 45 scenarios, for example, there are about 25 or 30 that has a testing priority 2.0 and above. And you say to yourself, okay, let me start with those 20 scenarios. Let me start with the scenarios that have testing priority 2.0 and above. And I'll test those first. And if I have more time, I can go back and pick up more scenarios that have lower than 2.0. The good news is this. You are doing this on the scenario level before you even have wasted any time to write test cases. So for the scenarios that you are not going to test for now, you are not going to waste any time to write any test cases or test scripts. You're just going to leave them alone. But then that's when you go back to your developers, and as I say here, you need to publish what you will be able to test, because there is no way to test everything. One more time. If you follow the scenario process, you will always come up with much more scenarios than one you can ever test. And the only solution, in my opinion, and of course, this is a good problem to have, right? To have much more scenarios to test than what you can test. But at least you share those scenarios with your developers, so you have some level of confidence that your scenarios, that your developers have already spent time writing code to address those scenarios. But the way you handle this is to go and select the highest priority scenarios. And you decide that those are the ones you are going to test. And share that, publish that with your developers. In fact, you go to your developers and say, listen guys, we are able to test those, but we're not going to be able to test those. Yes, it is very healthy to let your developers know what you are not testing. It's not the other way around, as some people think. Why should I let my developers know what I'm testing, what not? Because if you assume that your developers are responsible people, which of course you have to validate that assumption, then you would know that your developers are going to focus a lot of attention on those scenarios that you are not going to test. Or at the very least, if developers are going to test on their own, they're going to test more of the scenarios that you are not going to test. This is how responsible developers are. I don't think your developers are going to be much different from my developers. I don't think there is a developer out there who's going to say, oh, the test team is going to test only those scenarios. Let me test them before them to make sure they work. Ridiculous. I don't think that's the case. It's going to be the other way around. Especially if the culture has been established to say, we will focus on something, you focus on the others. And it will be known. I mean, I know some of you might think that I'm speaking very theoretically here or hypothetically. No, that's the way it happens. Developers are going to be okay to know that you are only testing certain things and they can test the rest. Let me tell you how I work this whole process with my developers and testers. Of course, I use a tool. I use the Romana ALM tool, which you can find a link to it from the Testing Institute site, the IIST.org, or just go to romanasoftware.com. Developers, testers, everyone uses the tool. So testers go and build the scenarios. They post the scenarios. Scenarios get validated online. Developers started taking the scenarios one at a time and write the code. But of course, they're working on one requirement. So a developer is working on one feature or one user story. And he or she writes the code for that. And we all know that developers are supposed to be performing some level of testing, right? So here's what I ask the developers to do. First of all, the tester will not test any feature or any bug fix unless the status of that feature or that bug fix has been changed to the following: tested by developer. That's accountability, by the way. So if a developer is writing code for a new feature and the feature sitting there in the tool goes through different states, one of the states, or I should say status, whatever you want to call it, of a feature or a requirement or a user story is tested by a developer. So the developer needs to go and change the status. Of course, he can tell me that a responsible developer will just go and change the status of a feature to tested by a developer without testing it. Well, it's not that simple, because the tool is designed such that if a developer changes that status, the tool will say, okay, before you do this, you have to mark those scenarios you tested. You cannot just go and change the status of a feature or a user story to say it has been tested and you have not indicated which scenarios you tested. So in my practice, in my process, developers have to go through scenarios. They have to select certain scenarios to test. And those scenarios they choose are the scenarios that the tested team had said earlier that they are not going to test. See how it works with me? So after a developer checks the scenarios that they have tested, and by the way, when they have a check mark next to that scenario, they are assuming the responsibility. This is what I mean by documented shared responsibility. Okay, so now The developer assumed the responsibility of those scenarios. The developer says, I tested those scenarios and they work, because the test team is not able to test them. So only then they can change the status to tested by developer, and then only then the test team or the tester can go and test that feature. Got that? All right, let's talk about one more thing in the next, I have 5 minutes left. There are many techniques out there, and I have not invented any one of those. And they are mostly requirement techniques. If you want to become a real QA person, you need to learn those techniques. Those are 3 of the ones I teach in some of my classes. The purpose of learning those techniques is not at all to know how to write good requirements or even know how to design tests. No. The person is to be able to collaborate and help developers do a better job. When you see a decision table, when you take the requirement and build a decision table or equivalence class partitioning or a state diagram or other things for that feature or that requirement or that user story, and you take that model or that picture and validate it with others, then you go back to developers and share it with developers. Okay, share it with developers. Now from that point on, that model we're talking about becomes the starting point. In fact, if you see a decision table, you'll see that you can take that decision table and write test cases precisely to test every column and every scenario in that decision table. And the same decision table will be given to the developers to write the code. So we're coming back to the same thing we did with scenarios. And instead, we're not going to be building scenarios this way. We're going to be building scenarios this way. So the decision table falls into this box. And you start taking the requirement, ask as many questions as you can, build your decision table, and that's why I said you have to learn decision tables. And take the decision table to validate it with others, with the business analyst, with the product owner, with everyone else. And once that decision table is finalized, that decision table is given to developers to write the code. You take the decision table and write the test cases. What I just said about decision tables also apply to other things, whether it is state diagram or equivalency classes. Validate and share. You make sure that, so all what I'm trying to do is really not to rely on requirements to write tests and write code, because I'm done with that. I am done with requirements. I've told you over and over again, requirements are never good enough. User stories are never good enough to design tests or to design code. My conclusion is this: always, if you want to become a true QA person, always strive for perfection. Always strive for perfection. Always do the good things. I don't know what your parents told you when you were young, but I know what my parents told me when I am young. Don't look what other people do. You go ahead. If you know what the good things to do, go ahead and do the good things. And when people see you doing good things, they will learn from you and they will learn how to do the good things. Hopefully you found this short webinar to be useful. Please make sure to fill out the evaluation sheet tomorrow, and I will, when you receive it tomorrow, with the follow-up message, and I will give the microphone back to Eric. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Hanna, for your time today, and thank you to everyone for joining us for today's webinar sponsored by IIST, the leaders in education-based certification training. For For more information on how IIST can help you or your organization, please visit www.iist.org. You can follow IIST on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube to find out more information about IIST news, events, and promotions. Thank you all again for joining us today, and have a great day.